The overarching theme for the year is the senses, and each term we're going to home in on one of the 5 senses, but we'll get to do 3. So this term it's going to be taste, next term it's going to be sound, and the final term, which is Trinity, will be touch. Okay. So I wanted to explain here in Oxford that the program has the wrong Hillary term date on it. So for those of you who have a pen, the next event, which is going to be sound in the brain, is Tuesday the 6th of February. And then the Trinity term, which is going to be touch, is Tuesday the 7th of May. And for those of you who don't have a pen, we're going to try and get this up onto Eventbrite as soon as possible. Okay? So you can just check and see it on Eventbrite. Now, some of those you probably know by now. This is a collaborative event with Hamburg, the medical school in Hamburg. And part of the reason for this collaboration is my colleague here, Professor Maike Glitsch, who will be speaking tonight as our first speaker, was a fellow here at St. Hilda's. She then moved to the medical school in Hamburg and has beautifully created a collaboration, which I have to say, we haven't had these technical glitches before at the beginning. We've had a couple throughout the middle, and they've been very quickly solved. So I hope we will get over this. And you can see there's going to be an audience up there. At some point you'll see the audience in Hamburg, and I'm going to take questions during the Q&A, both from Hamburg and from here. So with any technical luck, it should run smoothly, and please bear with, because we are doing our best. And I think we've got so many new people in college that it's probably going to take us a while to iron out the glitches and then make sure it doesn't happen next time. Now, our host in Hamburg, as you heard, is Ulf Baumgarten, and some of you may have heard him speak here at an event about a year and a half ago. So, now, many of you will be regulars, and you'll know that these events are designed to bring together an eminent researcher from 3 disciplines, that's neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy, to speak about a topic that's of interest to each of the disciplines. So this is what we sometimes now call an interdisciplinary event. But I should explain that we don't ask the speakers to confer beforehand or try to make their talks coincide. Rather, we simply choose speakers who work on the topic we've chosen to discuss and ask them to talk about it from the perspective of their discipline. And what's so utterly fascinating, and I hope you'll agree at the end of the evening, especially our young scholars, is how different the approaches from each of these 3 disciplines can be. And yet they claim to be researching the same phenomenon, right, the topic at hand. Now, I'm a philosopher, so I'm going to introduce tonight's topic from the perspective of philosophy. I hope this is not too annoying. The senses are of particular interest to philosophers because they are, think about it, the conduits by which we come by our knowledge of the world. We have 5 senses: taste, smell, hearing, touch, and sight. It's an interesting question how these senses interact, if they do. It's also an interesting observation that when we see with our eyes and taste with our tongue and the like, we not only get information about the world and hence come to have knowledge about the world, but the information we receive is accompanied by what we call a phenomenology. The philosopher Tom Nagel called it a what it is likeness, and this is associated with each of the senses. We see things as colored, so for example the British post box is red and shiny, and we taste things as bitter, like a lemon, or sweet, like a piece of cake. We might ask further, where is the color that I see, or the sweetness that I taste, or the sound that I hear? And of course, there's the question, what is it about the way our senses are designed and hooked up with the other parts of our bodies that makes taste possible? I believe we're going to get an answer to some of these questions and others from our speakers tonight. We're going to have 2 talks, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. Then there'll be a break for tea and coffee. and we'll return for our final talk and a longer Q&A. So, we've lost a bit of time already, so I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who, as I've already said, is Professor Maike Glitsch. And I have to say that it was Professor Glitsch and I who came up with this idea for this very kind of event 10 years ago over lunch here in college. And we were surprised by the fact that we both had an interest in, I think it was personal identity. And here she was, preclinical medicine tutor, and I was a philosopher. And we were wondering, whoa, that's interesting. Maybe we should talk to our students about this, which is what we did. Hence, you're here tonight. And she's going to talk to us about taste in the brain.
Thank you very much, Anita. Am I right in assuming that I just need to start this presentation? Okay, can you see? Okay, I'll just assume that you can see. Perfect. I have to apologize first for the rather bland title. I also need to make a disclaimer. I'm here in my capacity as somebody who is teaching medical students. I do not yet actively research taste. I also need to make another disclaimer, and that is that actually the theme is wrong. Rather than being called taste and the brain, we should have said flavor and the brain. And I obviously realized that the moment I started writing my talk.
You're almost unintelligible because of the echo, which seems to be getting worse.
Have you got Zoom on that computer there?
Yeah.
Yeah, well you need to turn your microphone off.
Is this on? Is this on?
The sound is off on this computer. The microphone is not on here.
Try again, Maike.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I mean, you can essentially read what I just said. The main point I'm trying to make for now is that it is actually virtually impossible to separate taste from flavor unless we take very special measures, and I have a feeling that maybe the psychology or philosophy speaker might be playing around with that a little bit. Because I'm a medical tutor, I approach any topic from the point of view of disease, and there are a number of taste disorders that we are aware of, but they don't receive a lot of attention because, generally speaking, not being able to taste usually doesn't mean that you're going to die imminently. You're all familiar with COVID-19 and the impact on taste. There's a disclaimer: taste and other respiratory infectious diseases tend to influence the olfactory system, and it's likely that the lack of taste perception is a consequence of lack of olfactory reception. There are some interesting taste disorders, though. We have taste confusion, for instance, in anorexia, where people say they taste food, that food has an abhorrent taste, when everybody else would say that actually it tastes very nice. And then there's some chemotherapeutics and antibiotics that, if taken for a prolonged period of time, will lead to so-called phantom taste, which is that you taste something that is not present. Very common in cancer patients is so-called metal mouth, where people have the perception that there's metal in their food. Antibiotics can lead to a profound salt sensation, which is very unpleasant. Even if you dip your finger in sugar, you will taste salt. I'm coming back to taste, and just why do we actually have the sense of taste? The sense of taste enables us to identify what kind of food we're putting into a mouth. After all, we're going to swallow this, it'll be in our body, and it'll be very hard to get rid of once it has been ingested. So we can identify what we're eating, the concentration of ingredients within the food that we're eating, and we will attribute a hedonic value, which means that we're going to make a decision based on the flavor, the taste that we perceive, whether or not it's worthwhile repeating that experience. In order for a compound to be picked up by our taste system, the tastant, so the chemical that we're going to perceive, must be soluble in saliva, and it must be present at a relatively high concentration. The only exception is bitter taste, as we're going to see. Classically, we distinguish five broad taste qualities: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, but you're going to see that we are in the process of expanding this. So I'm just going to give you an overview over roughly how taste is perceived through the tongue. We have the tongue. On the tongue, we have so-called taste papilla, That is this structure here. You can see it's just a specialization of the tongue surface. We have these so-called trenches in which the saliva will accumulate. The saliva has the tastins dissolved in it, so we're making sure that these taste buds, these gray structures here, one taste bud is enlarged here, are actually exposed to the tastins, because these taste buds themselves consist of the taste cells. You can see here the taste cells have microvilli, the taste pore is exposed to the saliva, and the microvilli have taste receptors expressed that are those structures on the cell surface that actually bind the tastin and so recognize its presence. I've enlarged here the taste bud, which consists of 3 different types of cells. You see again, we have the taste receptor cells in purple here, support cells, and then we have basal cells that sit kind of at the base of the taste bud. And the taste receptor cells are very interesting because they actually regenerate about every 2 weeks because they're exposed to anything that we have that we put into our mouth, and because they're important because they have, as I said, the taste receptors. The basal cells are the ones that are actually repopulating the taste receptor cells. So once the taste receptor cell dies, it is replaced by a newly forming taste receptor cell that arises from the basal cells here. And you can see that the taste cells release compounds that are picked up by gustatory afferent nerves, and that then send the information to the brain. Okay, so how now is taste transported? So we've had tastin binding to the taste receptors. We have release transmitter here. We've excited gustatory neurons here. How is the taste now transported to the brain? And there were 2 competing models, 2 extremes of 2 possible versions. One was the cross-fiber model, which said that every single taste receptor cell expresses taste receptors for all the 5 different taste qualities, and then it's the distribution of the taste receptors and the integral of the activity of the taste afferents that determines what taste is produced in the brain, ultimately. The model that is now favored and that has been virtually proven for mice is that of labeled lines, which is analog the olfactory system, and that is that we have one receptor taste cell, one taste cell that will express only one type of taste receptor, and then a number of different taste receptor cells will converge on one afferent neuron that will then carry that taste modality to the brain. And for humans, this seems to be true with the disclaimer that sometimes we may have predominantly one receptor, but maybe also the odd other receptor in one taste receptor cell. There are different types of taste papilla that you can see here. We have the circumvallator, which sits in the back of the tongue. These ones express predominantly, but not exclusively, taste receptor cells that detect bitter. The point here is that anything that we're going to swallow needs to bypass this back of the tongue here. So if anything is bitter, we have the option of throwing up and not actually ingesting it. What you can also see is that in addition to 3 different taste papilla, which we find in different parts on the tongue, we also have these filiform papilla here. They are not taste receptors, they're actually receptors for texture, so they're mechanical sensors. They sense whether we are eating something that's liquid or whether that's something that's crispy or something that's floury. I don't want to go into too much detail on the taste receptors. Let me just suffice to say that we can taste salty because we need to take up electrolytes, so we develop an appetite for salts. Sour is essentially a protective sense because fermentation can create acids. Think of vinegar and unripe fruit, so we're warned of something that might be spoiled here. Sweet has an extremely high threshold to be detected. This ensures that we're only ingesting foods and seeking out foods and expend energy in the process if the food is actually worthwhile eating, because if it's very sugary, it contains a lot of energy and that will promote our survival. Bitter is the sense that has the lowest threshold. It has a 10 million lower threshold for detection than sweet. And this is because a number of plant alkaloids actually that are toxic to us, we have evolved to detect their taste as bitter. It has the highest number of different receptor genes. We have 25 genes, we have 11 pseudogenes, so we're able to detect an awful lot of different bitter tastes. And I'm going to give one example, taste receptor 2, number 38. That's the gene that's responsible for not liking cabbage. So if you don't like broccoli, if you do not like Brussels sprouts, you probably have this receptor expressed and it binds the compound very well, whereas people who don't mind, they probably have a mutation in this receptor gene. Umami finally is responsible for the savory or meaty taste. It promotes uptake of amino acids. Some of the amino acids are essential, so we actually need to promote uptake of protein, and that's achieved through umami. We also know that there's other taste modalities, qualities. We can distinguish spiciness, and here we have a problem in the English language, because if I say hot taste, or if I say something is hot, you might not know whether I mean the temperature or the spiciness. So in German we have two different words for that. I'm now talking about spiciness, so when I say hot food, I mean spicy food. It actually turns out that we can use the same word as you do in the English language because the receptor that detects spiciness, hot food, also detects actual heat, the temperature. So it's the same receptor, but it's differently connected to our brain, and therefore it conveys different messages. If we perceive spicy food, then the active ingredient is capsaicin, which is found in red chili peppers, and it's also, TRPV1 is also a pain and an acid sensor, so it's actually a jack of all trades. So if you cut chilies with your fingers, and you hold it with your fingers, and then you rub your eyes, you feel intense pain because the TRPV1 receptor gives you the spicy taste, but it also elicits pain in your eyes, for instance. Birds don't have this receptor, so in the States, people use peanuts that are covered in capsaicin because squirrels that compete with birds for food do taste spiciness, and so this is a dramatization of a squirrel that just bit into a nut. You can see the nut here that's covered in capsaicin. Don't worry, no squirrel was harmed in the making of this talk. And so the squirrels avoid the peanuts, but the birds can eat it because they don't taste it. Then we come to fat, and we all know that fatty foods tend to have a different, sometimes a richer flavor. We actually don't know if there's separate fat receptors, if it enhances the taste, or if it influences the texture that the fat gives to the food, and whether that influences how we perceive the food. Other sensory modalities that also influence how we perceive the food that we eat is the temperature. I've already mentioned TRPV1 for hot. We also have TRPM8 for cold temperatures. And actually, if you eat menthol or brush your teeth, the cold flavor that you get, that is TRPM8 here again. But also some components of the sweet signaling cascade can actually pick up temperatures, so they work better when food is warm. And you know that warm milk tastes sweeter than cold milk. And if you eat ice cream, it tastes just about right. If you let it melt and then you drink the liquid, it actually tastes very sweet. And finally, the fullness of our stomach is being measured and is being reported to our brains, and it also affects how we perceive taste. So how does all of this come together to centrally create the expression of flavor? And we can't have a neuroscience talk without a brain, so I thought I'd put up a brain. And the information that comes from the tongue and in general from the mouth cavity reaches first the NTS, the nucleus of the solitary tract, where we have information from the taste receptors, but also the information on texture and on stomach distension. The information goes to the gustatory thalamus. That's essentially Gloucester Green in the brain. Everybody arrives there, and everybody goes from there, except for olfactory inputs. And then we reach the insula and the operculum, which is the primary taste cortex. So this is the first time here that we have an organized way, a beautifully organized way of representing the different taste qualities. We have here cells that respond to the different taste qualities and to the sensory qualities here, like the texture and the temperature, but they do not yet respond to olfactory or visual stimuli. This happens when we're in the secondary taste cortex, the so-called orbitofrontal cortex, which sits roughly about there. In this secondary taste cortex, and secondary cortices are always involved in providing general context to a stimulus that we receive so that we can respond in an appropriate manner. And so you can see that this orbitofrontal cortex now also takes into account not just the taste modality and the taste quality and the texture and the temperature, it also looks at what does it look like. In Germans we have a saying, the eye eats too, so how the presentation looks matters. And it also takes into account, importantly, olfactory signals here. This part of the brain is essential to allow us to learn to avoid or to seek out certain flavors because they promote our well-being. And there are some neurons that will actually respond to a particular food that they see. These are food-specific neurons. And I don't know if about 10 years ago there was a big hype about the Jennifer Aniston neuron. Don't know if you heard about that one. That's one neuron in your brain that will respond to anything to do with Jennifer Aniston. She can be shown from back, front, young, old, just the name written down. That neuron will say, yep, I know her. And it seems like we also have neurons that are specific, one neuron that is specific for a food. So if you have a particular comfort food, mashed potatoes with bangers and mash, I don't know, then you may well have a bangers and mash neuron in your brain that lights up every time you think about it, see it, smell it, whatever. Some of these neurons also will respond only as long as you're hungry, and then as you stop being hungry, these neurons stop responding to the stimulus that you're eating. And very importantly, some of the neurons are able to encode a food reward value. So that is an expectation, and very much like some people somewhat unkindly rate other human beings based on their appearance, so say, this person is a 5, this person is a 6. There's some neurons in the orbitofrontal cortex that will do that about food. They will say, yeah, that's a 4, or that's a 10. And this is important when it comes to our reasoning why we actually eat food. So now I've explained how flavor is formed. We're putting together all sorts of different sensory modalities, visual, olfaction, texture, temperature, and the actual taste information. The question is now, how do we evaluate what makes us like a flavor? And for that, we need to look on how information is processed further on from the olfactory cortex, which goes to the anterior cingulate cortex and to the hypothalamus. And these two structures are involved in pretty much opposite things. The hypothalamus is all about emotions and subconscious processes that take place, whereas the anterior cingulate cortex is all about decision-making, and in particular about decision-making based on reward anticipation. That's why I highlighted it here. Pretty much anything that I highlighted now has to do in some way with why we eat what we eat. And these two structures then project to the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, and I've summarized here at the bottom the whole pathway again. And those two brain structures are our reward system. This is where our body assesses how worthwhile something is doing. The reward system can influence our food intake, and food intake, again, from a medical point of view, is very important to understand, because if we take in too much food, we may become obese, and obesity is comorbid with dementias, with cancer, with cardiovascular disease, with metabolic syndrome. Think of a disease, obesity probably is comorbid with it, except for anorexia, probably. Good, so in order to understand why we eat food, we need to understand that there's two systems that control whether or not we eat. The one system is the needs-based system. This system is located in the hypothalamus. We have two distinct populations of neurons here. Stimulation of these neurons in red inhibit food intake, and they increase our metabolism. And stimulation of this population here promotes food intake and decreases the metabolism. So in other words, the red neurons allow us to spend time doing other things than eat, while expending energy, whereas the green system allows us to build up reserves with newly ingested food. Whether or not the red or the green population of neurons is stimulated depends on our hormones largely, but also on nutrients. If we've ingested food, recently ingested food, then we tend to stimulate the red pathway here. But then two very important hormones are ghrelin and leptin. Leptin signals our adipose tissue amount. So the more adipose tissue, so the more fat deposits we have, the more leptin we release. and the less long we've eaten, so the longer we've been waited to eat, the higher the ghrelin level in our bloodstream. So ghrelin is our hunger hormone, and leptin will reflect our adipose tissue state. So this needs-based system essentially allows us to maintain our body weight. We stop eating when the system is satisfied that we've eaten enough to maintain our body weight, and we can now do other things that further our survival, like find shelter, talk to other people, etc. But that's obviously not how it works, because we wouldn't have obesity if we were purely needs-based. So why do we eat what we eat? And there's emotions come into it. We might be upset and eat a lot or not. There's the hedonic factor. We enjoy what we eat. Social factors. In certain surroundings, we will eat. Funerals, weddings. Always there's food on hand. Convenience. You know, you're going down there, you're a bit hungry, there's some food, yeah, I'll just eat it. And of course, cost will determine what kind of foods you eat. Because we're talking about taste, I'm going to look at hedonic factors here. And so in addition to the needs-based system, I have another system which I call the gosh, that looks tasty system. And the gosh, that looks tasty system completely overrides the needs-based system by directly stimulating the green population of neurons here and promoting food intake in the absence of any energetic requirement. This system allows us to build up energy stores in the absence of energy requirement, so that next time there's a famine, we're not going to starve because we've built up nice reserves. Importantly, this system is located in the frontal lobe. I'm being deliberately vague here, including the orbitofrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, which we've already mentioned, and also includes the reward system that I've already mentioned. And the gosh, that looks tasty system allows us to increase our body weight. So we're never encouraged to lose body weight, but we are encouraged to increase our body weight. And food intake and reward are very closely knit, because if we look at the reward system, we will find that the same hormones that influence the activity of the two opposing populations of neurons also influence the reward system by deciding how much dopamine is released in this system. The higher the dopamine release, the higher the reward that we get. And leptin will decrease how much dopamine is released, and ghrelin will increase how much dopamine is released. So the higher the ghrelin and the lower the leptin, the more dopamine is being released. And you're all familiar with that. When you're really hungry, food tastes so much better than when you're already full. And that's the ghrelin effect here. There's also connections to the hypothalamus, the emotional center, and again, this goes both ways. In this case, which is interesting, so your mood will influence how you perceive food, but also you can modulate your mood by eating certain foods. Think of comfort foods that you probably all have, and you can influence your mood that way. Finally, we also know that we release more dopamine if we eat foods that we've eaten before and that actually had a high caloric value. So somehow there's a memory, and we say, ooh, the donut, yeah, that was really good. Lots of energy from that. I'm really liking this. So same food, but with an artificial sweetener, we'll say, didn't do it for me. So how much dopamine is released depends entirely on the whole body context. And the released dopamine is compared with how much dopamine was anticipated to be released. Remember the neurons that are going to say, yeah, that looks like a 5. And then we're going to say, so how much was it actually? And maybe it was a 4. And we're going to be disappointed. Or it was a 10. And then we're going to be really excited and eat more of it.
Maike.
Yeah. Yeah. So the problem with this is that a disappointing dopamine release might entice us to eat more, to get a higher dopamine hit, and food that makes us feel better will also entice us, so we'll eat more just to feel better. So taste and flavor is essentially a sense that we have to help us determine which foods are safe and life-promoting to eat. And the link to the gosh, that looks tasty system means that it can promote food intake in the absence of energetic requirement, which leads then to obesity. And I'll finish up by just reiterating, from the neuroscience point of view, peripheral sensing contributes to flavor, and you see that taste only makes up a tiny part of that. All these other factors are very important, but how we rate the flavor that we perceive depends entirely on our internal state. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Maike. That was actually really fascinating. Now, when you come back, can I just ask you, you will find on your seats a little, not an envelope, a plastic bag. Don't sit on it. Pick it up carefully. There may be 2 plastic bags, yeah? And one's going to have a little tasting strip in it, and the other's going to have, I don't know, some nose plugs and jelly beans or something, because we're going to all do a little experiment. So don't sit on your jelly bean. Pick it up when you come in. Have a cup of tea, and let's hope we can sort out the technical problems. Thank you for bearing with. And now what we're going to do is have 2 speakers, and then have whatever time's left, which will be considerable. And we'll have a big Q&A at the end. So it's a little bit different from some of the other events if people have been to that. So the next 2 speakers may be known to some of you from their work outside of academia. I urge you to read the program to learn about their work. There was so much that they've done that I couldn't put it all in here. So we've written it in the program. I don't know about you, but I sometimes watch MasterChef. And one evening, I was surprised when both of them appeared together as tasting experts in one of the finals. I was very impressed, Barry. Now, the first of this duo is Professor Charles Spence, who comes to us from the other side of town, that's Somerville College here in Oxford, where he's Professor of Experimental Psychology, specializing in the study of multisensory experience. He's worked with world-famous chefs, baristas, parfumiers, and the like. And the title of his talk this evening is Multisensory Flavor Perception. Charles.
Yes, I think we are. Okay, so pleasure to follow up and to be squeezed between the medic or the neuro person and the philosopher at the other end. Barry and I often talk together at events on taste and flavour. And in fact, we bring the same party tricks along. So I've got my jelly beans and tasting strip as he brought. Though on this occasion, I think we're going to use his jelly beans, because his are in date, I imagine, whereas mine are best before 2013. You can't find these anymore. These are confused jelly beans. If anyone's tempted, I'll let you try them a little later. And we'll see how we go. Maybe Barry will get both of them, or maybe I'll steal one, or share one each. And it's probably a nice place to be between the philosophers and the neuroscience, which is where I find a lot of my research on food and flavour. Really kind of going against William James, sort of one of the godfathers, I suppose, of experimental psychology, the department from which I'm based, who writes back in 1892 of the food lover's prized possessions, taste, smell, as well as hunger, thirst, nausea, and other so-called common sensations need not be touched on, as almost nothing of psychological interest is known concerning them. The lower senses, the common senses, who cares if we don't know much? There's not really much of interest there. I think is very wrong, and in fact there is a lot more to taste, as this advert from Lavazza kind of captures it. I think there's so much more to taste that we're still just starting to uncover, and that raises both philosophical questions, that Barry is obviously much better to answer than myself, but also relies on the kind of the neurophysiological findings, some of which we've heard about a moment ago. And just to sort of reiterate that point, that really one of the titles of one of my favourite papers from the 1930s is, eating is the most dangerous thing we do. That sort of life and death decision about whether we put that thing into our mouths that may poison us. There aren't many more important decisions, and taste or gustation, the sweet, the sour, the bitter, mostly the bitter, are there as the arbiters to stop us from swallowing the stuff that we think that might not be so good for us, that might be poisonous. But as has been mentioned, working in this area is sort of difficult in as much as there's confusion between the everyday usage of the term taste and the kind of scientific usage of that term. That most people, when we say, I like the taste of this, I like the taste of that, I like the taste of that bit of cake outside, we're really using taste to refer to the flavour of the thing, not specifically identifying just what our taste buds on the tongue picked up, going beyond the sweet, the bitter, the salty, the sour, and the umami, which are other ones there might be. And yet, throughout, probably from the philosophy to the anthropology to cultural studies, wherever you look, there's this confusion between taste and flavour that's sort of illustrated here by Carol Korsmeyer's book, The Taste Culture Reader, where in the introduction she's trying to set things up. Hopefully Barry will remember this from years ago. Except where otherwise specified, the word taste in this book serves as a shorthand for the experience of flavour in all its dimensions, including those supplied by the other senses. So far, so good. And then a couple of pages later, we're saying not all flavours can be classified according to the 4 basic tastes, or types. And some of the most sought-after tastes are actually spices. So which are the 4? I guess she means sweet, bitter, salty, sour, in which case she's referring to tastes rather than flavours. Flavours being the meaty, the floral, the creamy, the herbal, the burnt, the roasted, all the stuff that our nose provides to the experience of what we taste and what we like the taste of. And if I sort of rose to the challenge, I think I could have taken taste in the title of the session to mean flavour, and that would have been nice and easy. But I wanted to sort of restrict myself to, really specifically, to taste, to gustation, to what goes on in the tongue and thereabouts in the oral cavity. And some of the questions that interest me and the people in my research group, some of them at least so far, are around these confusions between tasting and smelling. Why it is that we all say that, food doesn't taste as much when we have a blocked nose or when we had COVID-19, say. When you test people, in fact, their taste buds are working fine. What they've lost is the ability to smell food. But why do we have this confusion between smelling and tasting? We don't seem to have it for any other senses. There are some out there who would say that this kind of confusion between smell and taste is really a kind of synesthesia that's common to us all. I think they're wrong on that, but that sort of raises some interesting questions that the undergraduates tackle on the psychology course. And maybe linked to this one, why is it that we say of certain aromas that things smell sweet? If I asked you, is vanilla, does it smell sweet or bitter or salty or sour? We'd all say it smells sweet. If we add it to food, it will enhance the taste of sweetness. And yet vanilla pods themselves are actually very bitter when you bite into them. Roses too. We rarely eat roses these days, but we often talk about roses smelling sweet. And why do we do so, and where does that sort of confusion or crossover or similarity come from? Now, it took me a long time to get into taste and flavour. I was initially doing hearing and vision and touch, the higher, the rational, the logical senses, as do most of my colleagues in psychology. But I like to sort of bring up this quote from J.Z. Young, famous biologist, just from a conference paper in 1968, but he says some sort of intriguing stuff. One thing he notes is that there's no animal that can live without food. Let us then pursue the corollary of this, namely that food is about the most important influence in determining the organisation of the brain and the behaviour that brain organisation dictates. Our brains have evolved to pay attention to determine the energy content of foods. That's perhaps partly the reason why I think in all species we know about that have a brain, you'll find the mouth is always located very close to the brain. Why is that? Perhaps because it's such an important function to find, forage food, attend to it, and then consume. But although taste, literally speaking, sweet, bitter, salty, sour, is kind of the ultimate arbiter of what we put in our mouths, life would be pretty hectic and dangerous if we had to go around the world putting everything in our mouth to figure out whether it was edible or not. Does it taste bitter? It might be poisonous. Or does it taste sweet? So instead, I think a large part of what the brain is doing is sort of predicting the taste of stuff. And that probably all of the senses are used in that job. You can sort of see here that we have the senses that are sort of technically used in the definition of flavour. We have gustation, sweet, bitter, salty, sour. We have oral somatosensation and trigeminal senses of pungency and the chilly burn, the cooling we heard about, but also this retronasal smells as we swallow and chew. That's all what technically we define as flavour. But before we put that thing into our mouth to experience the taste and the retronasal aroma, we look at it first And that's why we eat first with our eyes. We also probably smell the cooking from the kitchen, the smell of the coffee, and that may lead us to decide to eat when otherwise we're not actually hungry, as we heard. Perhaps the sound of the sizzle of the steak on the hot plate. These sort of distal flavour senses are not part of the flavour percept, but they do help us to predict. This plant here, it looks... Would you eat it? I'm going to invite some of you to eat it a little bit later. But probably from eye alone, you might say it looks like a plant, maybe it looks tasty, maybe it looks dated, and who knows. But you can use vision to make predictions based on learning that maybe ripe fruits tend to be sweeter and redder in colour, and hence they're worth climbing the tree for, whereas sour, unripe fruits are probably greener and have less energy. And hence we learn these correlations and hence use colour to infer, to predict taste. To avoid this kind of situation, here we have some Asian consumers tasting something that looks like Nutella, maybe, on a slice of bread, brown and chocolatey, delicious, sweet, but their facial expression says it all. They're not tasting what they expected. In fact, they're pulling what we like to call the Marmite face, or the Vegemite face. They were expecting something sweet based on what they saw. In fact, they're tasting something very savoury, umami-ish, and that disconfirmation of expectation is negatively valenced. It means our brain's got it wrong. We might be poisoning ourselves, hence this sort of ejection response. That's very unpleasant at the time, and which Barry, I know, can tell you a lot more about Marmite. He's been doing experiments as a philosopher on Marmite effect. Love it or hate it. And it was exactly that face that really got me into the world of taste. Because it was that face that the diners at the world's soon-to-be top restaurant, the Fat Duck in Bray, pulled, this Heston Blumenthal's venue, when he served this dish, which we see it, and within a blink of an eye, within 100th of a second, our brain has made a prediction about what the taste, the energy content of that food will be. Is it worth paying attention to, following, tracking, and ultimately eating? Most of you will think that's sweet, that's probably raspberry, strawberry ice cream, I like it, but maybe not so healthy, probably a lot of fat in there, might need to go to the gym afterwards, but yes, I like it. Yet in this case, your eyes are again misleading you, because this was actually a historic savoury ice cream, frozen crab bisque, or smoked salmon ice cream. So the taste, the colour is perfectly natural to smoked salmon, crab bisque, but just not what you're expecting. And when the world's top chef, down in Bray, 40 minutes from here, had his diners in his restaurant pulling the Marmite face to a dish that he thought was perfectly seasoned, saying it tastes really too salty, that's when he reached out to psychologists in the University of Sussex, and we started collaborating to try and find out what is actually in the mind of the person who's doing that tasting. Because up here, the area that psychologists study, where the sight, the sound, the smell, the taste, the texture, the mood, your emotion, the storytelling all come together. And then our brain does this amazing job of ventriloquizing that sensation and convincing us we're tasting it in the food that's moving around in our mouth. And while the taste may be set by what we see, and it may give us accurate prediction normally, if we're in a modernist molecular restaurant, maybe our eyes mislead us. We have the disconfirmation of expectation. But beyond that, even the colour of the environment can change our taste perception. I'm working with Ferran Adrià, another world's leading top chef, in his foundation over in Spain. We served people what looks like and is the strawberry mousse. Same people on the same day, in the same place, eating the same batch of strawberry mousse, either from a black plate, then from a white plate, or vice versa. We asked them, how sweet does this mousse taste? How flavourful, and how much do you like it? And amazingly, even though it's the same stuff that people are tasting, they say that the mousse served on the white plate tastes significantly sweeter by about 11%. 13% more light, 9% more flavourful, simply from the colour of the plate. So while you can't literally taste the plate, nevertheless the colour of the plate or the environmental lighting can also modulate taste in ways that we're only starting to understand. But the problem is, when we restrict ourselves strictly to taste, there are all sorts of erroneous facts out there. I was just in the Corpus Museum over in the Netherlands last week talking to culinary experts. And it's like a museum that's like the human body, and you wander through the inside, through the heart and the lungs and the legs and the brain. And part of the exhibit, you're walking through the mouth from the inside perspective. Here you can see kind of the tongue that you can walk on. It's very soft and squidgy, like a real tongue. And as the information, the talk speaker comes on, they say we have 4 tastes. And sweetness, don't you know, you taste it on the tip of your tongue. Bitterness, you taste at the back of your tongue. A sourness at the side, salty somewhere else. This is meant to be an educational facility, talking about the spatialization of taste in the mouth. Something that dates back to 1908 and to a German text that was mistranslated by a North American psychologist, that was boring, in the 1930s. And ever since then, most of the medical textbooks, not my colleague here, is very careful in her wording, but most medical textbooks, this museum I was at, suggest that we do have a tongue map. Sweet is in the front, bitter at the back. And that turns out to be more or less completely wrong. And yet, how can medical textbooks still come out saying there's a taste map? How can this museum in the Netherlands have it as current fact that there are sweetness on the tip of the tongue? There's a lot of sort of mystery in here, I think, and a sort of a conflict in a way between the neurophysiologists who will say, I'll only attribute experience if I know which receptor is doing the work, and if I think that the receptors for taste are distributed evenly over the whole mouth, that must mean taste is experienced equally all over the mouth. And yet in our phenomenology, it's different. I think most of us do experience bitterness more at the back of the mouth than at the front. And so I think there are some interesting integration things going on here between taste and texture. Many bitter compounds will also be a bit astringent, and hence you might get a tactile sensation that you do localize to the back of the mouth that may bind bitterness with it and give us an illusion, if that's the right word, of a spatialized taste. So maybe there's some truth in the tongue map after all. It depends quite how you phrase it. And maybe the way our first speaker did, that there's some tendency towards increased bitterness at the back. It's probably a safe bet. I will leave this one for Barry, but I will mention this one next. Here we have the My Aged Skittles, or Your Fresh Skittles. And for this, I would like you to take one of Barry's nose clips and put it on your nose, as if you're going deep sea diving. I shall do that myself. There we go. And then taste one of your jelly beans and think about what you experience. Probably you get some sweetness, maybe a bit of acidity, but that's kind of it. What's the flavour of the jelly bean you're tasting? Hard to say, just sweet, a bit acidic. Until you take your nose clip off, and suddenly you get the flavour, you get the fruitiness, you get the aroma, and it's like, that's the 75 to 95% of what we all think we taste that's actually coming from this retronasal sense of smell being ventriloquized into our mouth. And then now we continue tasting. I'm convinced that I can taste the fruity flavour on my tongue, where that jelly bean was. So it's like this, I've mislocalized from my nose to my mouth, where in fact the chemosensory stuff was happening. And according to the stats, it is somewhere between 75 to 95% of what we all think we taste, we really, really smell This number, this percentage, sounds very scientific, sounds very precise. If you go back, this, like most other statistics, we love numbers, we love precise numbers and percentages. There's no evidence for it, but I think it does sort of fit with our intuitions about the way we experience things, especially after having tried the jelly bean test. Okay, so just to finish up, how long have we got? 5 minutes? Oh, yeah, easy. Yeah, oh, good. I want to think about what some of the research we've been doing in the last couple of years to go beyond taste in a way. Going back to that Lavazza point, there's more to taste. I'm sort of thinking about why is it that taste is only experienced in the mouth? Wouldn't it be fun if we could experience tastes on our fingertip, or on our earlobe, or on our foot? And with all the tricks at the psychologist's disposal, all of these rules of multisensory integration, of ventriloquism, of sensory dominance, is there a way that we could take taste out of the mouth? And is there more to taste than just those 4 or 5 tastes, bitter, sweet, salty, sour, umami? We heard the notion of metallic, which might be a taste, might be a flavour, might be an aroma, might be all of those things. We're still not quite sure. Probably all of those things. Fatty acids, another possible taste. And what else? But these things are all localised on those taste buds, primarily on the tongue and on the soft palate. Well, what have we got here? We've got some the Duke of Wellington's extra virgin olive oil from his hunting estate in Spain. And last time I had dinner with the Iron Duke, he gave me some of his olive oil. But if I want to know how good the Duke's olive oil is, what I'll do is I'll just taste a little. And that is a very good olive oil. Because if you heard me, I coughed twice. And the sign of a good olive oil is whether it's 1 cough or 2. But how am I detect what's going on there? There's some sort of sensitivity. If you drink ibuprofen, it does the same thing, it's got the same compound in it, that seems to be detected by receptors in the throat and leads to this 1 cough or 2. That's not one of the 5 basic tastes. It's not a flavour, it's not an aroma, so what is it? Something else going beyond the mouth in a sense. Or maybe we've got a different route to taking taste out of the mouth. So if you go online, it's rumoured that if you get some garlic cloves, crush them up, put them in a plastic bag, and put that plastic bag on your foot, then about 30, 60, 90 minutes later, you can taste. You'll have garlic breath. So listen, one of the key compounds that gives garlic its garlickiness can go through the skin and makes its way from your foot into your mouth when you breathe, and you taste garlic. But you're sort of tasting it through your foot. Or are you? Sort of interesting there. There are other things you can do with soy sauce, if you're a boy, but I won't go there today. And instead jump to, where have you gone? This, which is another way of taking taste out of the mouth, built on our previous work on the rubber hand illusion. Get a rubber hand, stroke it while a person's hand's hidden out of view, and almost everyone thinks that their rubber hand they see being stroked is their own body, and it becomes rubbery, and your body becomes mislocalized. 1,000 published papers now on the rubber hand illusion. We just took that and transmitted it to the mouth. And we have a little mirror box you can see in the top left, and like the cat is demonstrating for us, we had our subjects in the laboratory stick out their tongue, stick it into this box, and there's a couple of mirrors there, and so through the mirrors you could see what looked like your tongue at a distance in the box. In fact, what you saw was a butcher's tongue, from the butchers if you can find one, or a rubber tongue, and then the experimenter would stroke out of sight the real participant's tongue. At the same time, you see through the mirrors this butcher's tongue being stroked, and the majority of people think that their tongue is the one they can see out there in the distance. And moreover, when you then start dribbling some lemon juice onto the butcher's tongue, while just dropping water onto the participant's tongue, a number of people can really taste the acidity. It's just water they've got, but those visual cues are so powerful, and it's kind of a taste out of the mouth. And when we had some North American professional magician here, said, "Wow, that is real magic. How on earth do you do it?" It's just sort of straightforward psychology, but maybe one of the ways to take taste out of the mouth. We haven't found like a restaurant use for this yet. It's sort of stuck in the laboratory so far, but potentially there's a way. And I think somehow tasting outside the mouth ought to be a really exciting thing. Finally, I want to mention how you can also manipulate taste experience through sound. If you're an Italian futurist in the 1930s, you might get people to rub some sandpaper and velvet, and it would change the taste. They thought it was syntactilismo of humanity. You have dinner parties where people would eat without knife and fork, gobbling the food on the plate, while at the same time rubbing their neighbour's clothing with the silk, and you turn up with pyjamas of satin and silk and sandpaper, and just try and find these synesthetic connections between what you were gobbling and what your neighbour was wearing. And I do have some sandpaper and silk in my bag, if anybody wants to come up later. Or what they were also doing is playing music in a kind of auditivo, they call it, synesthetic audition, that we've been working on for a decade now, giving people something to taste, like this chocolate lolly, something that has bitterness and sweetness, like a 70% cacao, bittersweet chocolate. And if we play music like this, well, music might be too much of it, but sounds like this, it makes that chocolate taste 10% more bitter. Play something tinkling and high pitch instead, and suddenly the sweetness comes out in your tasting experience. It's the same chocolate in your mouth, but simply by changing the sound, it's possible to modulate the taste. That was first launched in 2012 with the Fat Duck restaurant in a restaurant in London. And ever since, we've been working to try and use sound and music to modify taste. And currently, when we do it with things like whiskey and wine and chocolate, so things with complex tastes that aren't just bitter or sweet, they're also nutty and savoury and so on. And so what we have to do very often is give people something to taste, like this mouthful of wine shown here, and then we plot over 45 seconds how your taste experience evolves. And here, for this glass of red wine, you've got some acidity comes out, and maybe it's the alcohol, then it's the bitter notes, the astringent, sweet, spicy, ending up in something else. So it's a real complex taste journey there, and we can use music, mapping different instruments and timbres, tempos, roughness of sound, to each of those elements in the taste experience, and so accentuate them in a way that people seem to find enjoyable, and that is now becoming known as a kind of sonic seasoning. So using these cross-sensory connections to change the way in which we taste, and maybe to do so in such a way to treat some of those obesity issues that were mentioned. Because if I can make your food taste sweeter, simply by playing sweet music that has no calories, who wouldn't want that as a sonic solution to future tasting experience? Thank you.
Wow. I can know what people are going to be doing tonight. We're going to go home with garlic on our food. I know I am, definitely. Hester Blumenthal, he was famous at the time when you were doing that earlier for The Sound of the Sea. And I was rather intrigued by this. We were having a big dinner in college, and I asked the chef if we could do something on that line, and we did a dinner with The Sound of the Sea, and it was just amazing. Everybody was just blown away by the experience. So in a little way, we've even done this in an Oxford college. Okay, so we have our final speaker of the evening, who's Professor Barry Smith. And unfortunately, Professor Smith had to speak at an event at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles in the United States today. But fortunately, technology, fingers crossed, has made it possible for him to speak to us from LA. So Professor Smith is a philosopher and is the director of the Centre for the Study of the Senses at the University of London's School of Advanced Studies. He combines his writing for academic journals in philosophy with writing for such journals as Nature, the World of Fine Wine, and the like. The title of his talk this evening is Tasting Flavors. So
yes, good, thank you. So Anita, thank you very much, and thanks to colleagues there in St Hilda's as well as our two speakers. It's a great pleasure to be following on from the two of them. And Charles and I work together a lot. We take in one another's washing, and so it's going to save me a lot of time to be able to rely on many of the things he said, and I'm also going to rely on many of the things that Maike said first, although I didn't hear them all. I did hear crucial things she said, which is going to be relevant to my talk. So now we've had neurophysiology, we've had psychology, and we're quitting the stage for the gallery, and usually that's when philosophers think, they're taking up the Olympian stance, but I think we just have to take a much more interdisciplinary, integrated stance to this. So I just want to remind you what ordinary folk say, and I'm going to ask whether we should pay more attention to that than we think. So we speak about the tastes that our foods have. We say the berries are sour. We say the soup is spicy. That the coffee is bitter. And are we right to speak in this way? Well, according to our science colleagues, no. And many science colleagues, you've heard two of them, will say, well, we're misspeaking. So certainly neuroscience seeks to correct our common sense way of talking about taste and say, we're not just talking about taste. Taste proper is just what happens on the tongue. In terms of the receptors, we have dedicated receptors for salt, sweet, sour, bitter, umami, maybe some others, maybe metallic, maybe fat. And that most of what we call taste is due to some interaction of taste, touch, and smell. Now, that's the multisensory revolution, as I want to call it, the idea that tasting is multisensory, not unisensory, and that's something that both Mike and Charles agree on, and Charles laid out in a very detailed way. But here's the other revolution that I want to look at, the scientific revolution, really when Galileo started giving very precise measurements of things. And then it was decided at that time that tastes and smells and things like that were not actually part of the world. They were just experiences in us. So the idea that tastes are a construct of the mind or the brain might be the modern way of putting it, rather than thinking they're actually out there in the world to be detected among the other things, the size, the shape of objects that we can measure. So these are the corrections to our ordinary way of speaking and thinking that we get from these two revolutions. One, tasting is multisensory, involves taste, touch, and smell at least. The second, that tastes or flavors are maybe psychological constructs. They're experiences going on in us and not answerable to something external to us in the way that we think our sight and our hearing is allowing us to pick out external things. Now, I'll just put up my agenda. So I will accept the first. In fact, I've learned an awful lot of what I now know about tasting and the multisensory experience that we call tasting from Charles, and I think he put me on this course. So I completely accept the multisensory revolution. Taste multisensory, I'm going to look at some of the things it involves, and we've already looked at that. But I'm going to reject the idea that tastes or flavors are psychological constructs. In fact, I'm going to reject something that I did here. I think I saw it on the slides that Maike said. Flavor is what happens in the brain. I'm going to completely reject that. And it's very funny that our neuroscience colleagues, who I work with, interact with, we have many collaborations, and I've written papers with some of them, I cannot get them to accept that things like tastes and smells are anything other than internal experiences. And as my colleague at UCL, Mark Calderon, puts it, what we have to say to our neuroscience colleagues is, the 17th century is on the phone and they want their metaphysics back. So I think we shouldn't accept this outdated metaphysics, and I'm going to try and explain why. So, there's a hidden complexity to tasting. We've heard a lot about that. What does the tongue contribute? The basic taste, salt, sweet, sour, bitter, umami, metallic, fat maybe. But here's one thing we might wonder. Do we all taste in the same way? And do we all taste the same things? So again, if you go into your pouches, your little packets, you will find a piece of paper. You'll find this little piece of paper, and I want you just to take it and just hold it between your fingers at the moment, because we're going to all do this together. So when you've got that little piece of paper ready, what I want you to do, I want you to get some moisture in your mouth, and then I want you to lay, and maybe Harry will demonstrate this for me, I want you to lay the strip of paper on your tongue, take the whole thing into your mouth, and then just tell me what it tastes of, if anything. Now, some of you will be finding it very bitter, and if any of you are having a very strong reaction, just take it out immediately. Please take it out. So maybe I can't see you, but maybe Harry wouldn't mind relaying it. So I really want a show of hands from people in the hall. Put up your hand if you find it tastes very bitter. So
Harry, can you tell me how many they are? It's quite a lot.
Over half.
Over half.
Over half, good, right. Now hands up if you find it just mildly bitter, maybe you're now beginning to get a little bit of bitterness, maybe like the taste of an aspirin. There are hands up there.
Very few. Maybe 4,
Very few.
5, 6,
Okay.
7.
Good. Now, if the numbers are right, given that it's over half of them, how many people, hands up, think it just tastes like paper?
That's the rest of them.
That's the rest of them. Okay, good. Got it. Now, that's an indication that if ever you needed it, that we don't taste things in the same way. So the first group who put their hands up to the very bitter, they're known, I think, quite well, they're known as super tasters. So you can all be high-fiving each other. And then the people who said it just tastes like paper, you are very unfairly called non-tasters. And I think that language is completely wrong, because it's not that you don't taste anything. So these paper strips are soaked in something called PTC, phenylthiocarbamide. And it's a tiny amount, and for people whose taste buds are very dense on their tongue, they're densely packed together, they've got lots and lots of them, and they're all sort of closely packed, you will be very quick to respond to bitter flavors like this, and you're being able to pick it out. Whereas for those of you who really don't get much or don't get anything, your taste buds may be very far apart. And let me just explain that what will make something, you're a very different group of tasters who live in different taste worlds, it might seem. Because for the people who have that quick reaction to the bitterness of the strip, very often you'll find you're very sensitive to and quickly responsive to saltiness. So what makes something salty is how many NaCl molecules are being touched or touching taste receptors. Now if you've got taste receptors densely packed together, you just need a tiny amount to get a salty hit. Whereas if people's taste buds and their papillae are very stretched out and more distant, you need to sprinkle more salt to get the same experience. Now, I'm telling you this because it can save relationships. Don't argue about how salty the soup is or the food is. It's salty, not salty enough. Let people salt their own food. Let them do what they need to do. Now, for people who are the so-called non-tasters, I just want to reassure you that at the far end of the super tasters, the ones who have an immediate reaction, whose faces just curled up with displeasure when they tasted the strip, they're very likely to be fussy eaters. There are going to be a lot of things that they probably don't want to eat, that they find too bitter or too sour, and they don't like Brussels sprouts, and maybe they don't like too many spices. Whereas you people who just say it tastes like paper, I call you adventurous eaters, because you want a lot going on. You add spices and flavors and salt and seasoning and so on to get a lot there. Now the surprise is that most chefs are not super tasters. They were all very disappointed when they tried this tasting strip, and they thought, well, I should be a super taster. But no, if they were real super tasters, they would be far too sensitive and they would probably under-season the food for the majority of people. And as Charles talks about working with restaurants, I was always trying to persuade people at the fact that if you're giving them a tasting menu, you should give them a tasting strip, and you should send them down one road to have dishes which are much less bitter and sour and salty, and then differently for the others. But they weren't prepared to make so many dishes, and I understand that. Okay, now the thing we shouldn't conclude, why did I ask you to do this? The thing we shouldn't conclude is, so taste is just subjective. There's a big confusion, and again I find this in my psychology and neuroscience colleagues, between individual differences and subjectivity. They say if there are individual differences, oh, it's subjective. No, we can give explanations of why you belong in different groups. I've just given one, and in fact it's a perfectly objective description of why you will pick out some of the things you do in a different way. So individual difference does not mean subjectivity. Subjectivity properly means nothing of what I'm experiencing when I'm having a flavor experience or a taste experience like this is answerable to a real property out there that I'm detecting and measuring. That's what I want to disagree with. So, as Charles said, most of what we can so-called taste is due to smell. You know, you look at raspberries, strawberries, gooseberries, mango, mint, peach, melon. You don't have melon receptors on your tongue, or strawberry receptors, or blueberry receptors. In fact, if smell isn't involved, you couldn't taste those things, as a lot of people found out during the pandemic. I was working with clinicians and patient groups during the pandemic, and so many people were reporting that they lost their sense of taste, and we would ask them to put some sugar on their tongue, or some lemon juice, or some salt. Can you taste that? Ah, yes, I can taste that, but that's all I can taste. And now they realize how much of what else they are experiencing is due to smell. And as Charles pointed out, it's not due to smell as we ordinarily think of it, breathing in odours from the environment up the nasal linings into the olfactory epithelium of the cleft of the bridge of the nose there. It's when the odours are going from the mouth up to the olfactory epithelium. So you can smell odours from the outside, and you can sometimes have the very same odour molecules travelling in a different direction to the very same receptor sheet, this little postage stamp size of skin that's at the top of the bridge of the nose. And it turns out that you might experience the very same odours differently depending on the direction in which they reach the epithelium. And they project to slightly different cortical areas, which is why you don't always get a match between how things smell outside the mouth, how they smell inside the mouth. As Charles and I are always reminding people, a smelly cheese like a wasp, it actually smells like a teenager's training shoe. Why would you put that in your mouth? And yet when you are putting it in your mouth and eating it, it's creamy, it's lovely, slightly tangy. Coffee goes in the other direction. We all love the smell of coffee. It's wonderful, smell of freshly brewed coffee. But aren't you just a bit disappointed when you taste it? It doesn't really have the same hit. And it never will, because it's just being delivered in a different way. Plus, saliva in the mouth will strip off about 300 of the 800 volatiles, so you won't have the same experience. So that's why coffee companies say, wake up and smell the coffee, not wake up and taste it. Now, as Maike said earlier on, there are different multisensory interaction sites. So the primary taste cortex in the insula and the olfactory bulb, the piriform cortex, are both going to send signals to the orbitofrontal cortex, which is not only a site for integration of these signals, but it's also got some evaluative potential there too. And we know that because of the work of people like Joseph Parvizi in Stanford, who's a neurologist who has epilepsy patients and does direct cortical recordings, where he's recording from the brain by lifting off a bit of the skull to find the site of the seizure, but he can stimulate the patients who say part, he can stimulate parts. And it turns out that stimulating the insula, the insular cortex, will also produce, as well as taste experiences, smell experiences. So there seems to be some flow back in the other direction. We still have a lot to work out about what these pathways are like. All right, so our brains must put together information about touch, taste, smell, temperature, The trigeminal nerve, so when you have something spicy, you're irritating the nerve endings of the trigeminal nerve, that's the fifth cranial nerve that serves the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. And when you're eating too much wasabi, where do you feel it? Ow, bridge of your nose. That's why when you're having too many spices and you're having too much irritation of those trigeminal nerve endings in mouth, the eyes will start to water because the trigeminal nerve is interpreting this as though the eyes are being attacked and it floods them to protect them. So there's a lot going on in flavour experience. And that's what leads our colleagues, I don't know where Charles stands on this, we've been around the houses of ours a few times, but I did hear from Maike the flavours, what happens in the brain. So are flavours just constructs of the brain? I mean, after all, we don't get flavour until we put together, so it's said, inputs from smell, taste, touch, might be influenced, as Charles said, from sound and sight. So is that just a construct? Well, many sensory scientists and neuroscientists say it is. Here is John Prescott. The idea of flavours is the outcome of the integration of tastes, odours, oral, somatosensory qualities as a long pedigree. Flavours can be most accurately seen as the objects constructed for their hedonic qualities. Flavours may be seen primarily as units of pleasure that influence our motivation to consume. Here's Gordon Shepherd, who nails his colours to the flag in the title of his book, Neurogastronomy, How the Brain Creates Flavour and Why It Matters. Another collaborator of mine, Noli Murtsen in Denmark, a gastrophysicist who's worked with NOMA, he says, flavour is all in the brain. When it comes to eating and enjoying food, it's the integration of the combined senses that produces what we think of as flavour. These combined perceptions are not actually derived from the food itself, but are products of the nervous system and the brain. The conclusion, flavour is all in the brain. Well, if flavour is in the brain, we should probably eat the brain. I don't think flavour's there at all. But let's continue. Here's the wonderful Harold McGee, who's an absolute lion of food science and food writing. And in his recent book, Nosedive, he says, though we casually say that foods have flavours and that flowers have smells, in fact, they are volatile molecules. Sensations and perceptions, smells and tastes and flavours are the products of our brain's 17th century metaphysics written on the sleeve. And here's another friend and collaborator, Dana Small, neuroscientist, neurophysiologist. She says, flavour is in the brain, not the food. It's the brain that integrates the discrete sensory inputs from the food and drink we ingest to create flavour perceptions. But be careful. The first sentence in that quote, which is the conclusion, is not supported by the second sentence, which is the argument, because we need to distinguish between flavour and flavour perception, just as we distinguish between colour and colour perception, sound and sound perception. So it's true that the brain integrates the discrete sensory inputs from food and drink that we ingest to create flavour perceptions. It does not follow that flavour is in the brain, not the food. Flavour perception is in the brain, created by the brain. So if we correct what John Prescott says, he's really saying flavour perception reflects the integration of distinct sensory signals, in particular foods and odours. So, what is flavour perception? Well, I want to say that the flavour perception system guides successful food choice. Its job is to try to latch onto and track properties of foods and liquids in the environment and what their flavours are so that we get what we want and what we like. There will be homeostasis reasons for salt intake, there will be all sorts of reasons as well as pleasures, but we're roughly tracking foods according to how they taste, and our flavour system is meant to pick that out and track properties of the foods. But there is a question for people who think flavour is in the brain and it's just a construct of putting together these sensory inputs or the integration of them. Why do we bind the particular sensory elements we do and not others? And which sensory inputs go into flavour perceptions? And what is it that unifies them? I mean, after all, while I'm eating, or while you were eating the cake in the break, you were also feeling the tiredness in your limbs. You might also be hearing people talk to you. might have been remembering having had banana, and you might even have a kind of association between banana and other things. So which bits of all the things we know are going on at that time come together and get bound to be flavour perceptions? Well, the two colleagues who I think have really led this field and actually opened up and made people so aware of it, and people who are absolutely crucial for the multisensory revolution and for certainly leading the topic, Charles Spence and Maike Glitsch. And in their 2008 paper, Multisensory Perception of Flavour, I really recommend it. It's the sort of, it's the ur text for all of this. They say flavour perception should be used as a term for the combination of taste, touch, smell, the trigeminal system, and so on. Now the and so on is kind of interesting because Charles is mentioning solid seasoning and science, he's mentioning sight, he's mentioning all sorts of things. And it turns out that our psychology colleagues tend to be maximalists about what goes into flavour perception. So here's Martin Yeoman's. Flavour perception is an integration of sensory information with past memory of similar stimuli, predicated by their visual qualities and accompanying written descriptor for the food rated. So, as Charles said, whether we describe something you're about to eat as crab ice cream, or, as Charles was going to testing to do, calling it frozen savoury beast or frozen crab beast, will have an effect on how you perceive the flavour of it. Charles also talking about what is actually Patagonian dogfish, which doesn't either look or sound very nice, is repurposed in restaurants with the term Chilean sea bass. Yes, I have the Chilean sea bass. And that's having an effect on how people like or perceive the flavour. So there's a problem of what the extent of flavour perception is. Should it involve liking? Should it involve the hedonics? I think I heard an echo of that in Maike's talk, that the hedonics might go into it. Should that be included? Well, all these cross-modal results, effects in one sense or another, they leave us with a problem. So what goes into flavour perception as part of it, and what merely influences or affects flavour perception? So when Charles, who's incredibly creative at figuring out wonderful experiments to adjust how you will perceive the flavours of things by the sounds that you're hearing, by the sights that you're having, is that part of flavour? Is it helping to constitute flavour perception? Or is it just causally affecting, perhaps even an illusion that's distorting flavour perception? Where do we draw the distinction? So that's the question. Thank you. So what gets integrated or bound? Why do we bind these elements and why do we go to tasting? Well, should the crisp sound of an apple, is that part of its flavour? Certainly part of the pleasurable experience of eating. If you mute that sound to people and they can't hear the crisp sound of an apple, they will find it much less pleasurable. The hedonics, is that part of it? Well, not really. If you're a professional taster and you're doing any professional tasting, I'm sometimes called upon to do some wine tasting of that sort, you try to keep the hedonics out of the way. You try to bracket them, put them to one side so that you can really perceive what's in there. That's why the goal of wine tasting isn't the emperor's decision, thumbs up or thumbs down. It's just what does it actually taste like? What's going on in this wine? So, one thing you could say is the reason why we find some information and not others, gustatory, retronasil olfaction, trigeminal information, why we find those is because by binding those, we're able to keep track of things in the environment. So here's a fact about multisensory perception. Why do we bind elements and make multisensory perceptual experiences that pull on different senses? Very often so we can keep track of a common environmental source. So I want to say that unifying assumption of multisensory perception means we are keeping track of a unified source, but that source is the flavour or the flavours of foods. So finally, summing up, closing in on the target, multisensory perception, which senses get integrated, and what are those perceptual experiences perceptions of? Well, when it comes to tasting, our two brains, maybe in this case 3 brains better than 1, and I think we need to distinguish the perspectives of psychology and neuroscience from the perspectives of philosophy. Now, part of the problem of getting what people think is object objectivity, let's say about the flavour of a wine. You know, can we give an objective description of a wine? Well, the chemists get very annoyed because they say, well, we can tell you all the molecular compounds, very complex molecular odor chemistry in wine, and talk about some of the properties that and how they interact. And then the psychologists like Charles come along and say, well, sensory perceptions are very varied and we can adjust them and they can vary in time, they can vary for people. So I think the answer is not to try to map sensory perceptions of tasters at times onto molecular compounds in wines. You won't do that. There's something in the middle layer. Flavor profiles of wines are what our sensory perceptions at a time are trying to pick out and track. And then we've got another problem, which is how do we get from the molecular compounds to something which is a sort of emergent property, not reducible entirely to the molecular, but dependent on molecular compounds. So this is my final thing to say. With different disciplinary perspectives, we can bring more in to flavor than my other two colleagues maybe want to admit. Flavor perception is the multisensory integration of information from taste, touch, smell, depending on how the effective job is working. Flavor is a technical term used to describe the sapid and odorous properties of a solid or liquid, including properties of its temperature and texture. So, psychology looks at the individual perceptions of tasters at times. Chemistry looks at the volatile and non-volatile compounds, say in wines. And philosophy posits something in the middle, the flavor perceptions of wines, which can develop. So the dynamics of that matters. So there are two tasks to do. How do we get people to be better tasters, and how do we get them to lock onto those flavor profiles? That takes work and effort. And then how do we do the metaphysics that says that flavor profiles are sustained by but not reducible to, but dependent on the chemical compounds. And that's it. Thank you very much.
So much, Barry. Fantastic. Okay, so I'm sure you desperately want to ask questions. So let me start with questions here in Oxford, and Harry will bring the microphone. Please speak into it so they can hear you in Hamburg. And Hamburg, please prepare your questions.
This is for any of the panelists. We have been discussing, or you have been discussing, how much is a construct of the mind.
Wait, can everybody hear?
Yes.
No, they can't hear. Is that on?
It looks like.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Barry, can you hear?
Well, perhaps if you don't mind repeating the question, that would help.
Yeah, no, you have been discussing if the flavors is a construct of the mind, but none of you have touched how much of the flavor or flavor perception is taught.
Is what?
Or is learned. Because it depends on quite a lot of animals. If you don't prime them, if you don't expose to certain flavors, they never recognize that as a food. Then how much of the flavor is a learned behavior more than a construct of the mind?
Okay, Barry, so the question was, how much is priming and learning involved in this flavor perception? So he's saying if they're not primed, if they've not learned, etc. What's the...
That's something I had tried to touch on in the end when I said what leads to the evaluation of a flavor. Social factors play a role, and we talk about acquired taste. That is a taste that we learn to enjoy because of social cues that we get. So some cultures might enjoy cheese, other cultures might find it disgusting, for instance. So there are a lot of liking alcohol is an acquired taste. So acquired tastes are very, very important. There are some tastes that are generally accepted to be positive, like sweet things. Most people like sweet things. They may also like salty things. But there are certain flavors that you will need the right social, cultural, whatever background in order to enjoy them. But you can learn, anybody obviously can learn to enjoy them. But that is then kind of a conscious effort.
Barry, did you hear that?
I did, and I will slightly go away from that. I think that's about valuation of flavor, and that's fine, but that's not the same thing as the perception of flavor. So the really key question is, if you have those differences in culture and priming and learning, what you're used to, so that some people will enjoy, some people find it too salty, too sweet, and so on. The question is, do they taste the same thing? Now here's a terrible argument, but it's so terrible that many professional philosophers make it. They say, if you like this food and I don't like this food, then it can't taste the same way to both of us, because if it tasted the same way to you as it does to me, you would like it. It doesn't follow at all. It might be it tastes the same way to both of us if we're, say, both super tasters or roughly have the same taste palate. But you like that flavor and I don't like that flavor. And that might be to do with our history and training, but it doesn't automatically rule out that we're not perceiving the same flavor.
I suppose most of our responses to any odorous compounds are always learnt. Maybe we're born liking sweet and disliking bitter, making these stereotypical orofacial gestures across species, but virtually all of our responses to the appearance or to the smell of foods, to the olfactory component, that we think is all learnt. And hence Bartlett explains why then vanilla becomes sweet to us as a result of it being found in Coca-Cola, ice cream, and so on.
Do we have a question from Hamburg? Okay, Hamburg, do feel free to ask a question. Do we have another one here?
I just wanted to ask if, for example, why pregnant women crave for some certain foods and our taste perception changes in different stages of life. So if it was only cultural or learned, why then it would change during a lifetime, even if it's not illness.
Good. Barry, did you hear that?
No,
okay.
sorry.
So the question was, if it is learned, why does it change over the course of a lifetime? Yeah?
Okay.
As we change stages of our life. But Charles is going to speak first.
So it'll change at different ways at different stages. You might think in development, there's a suggestion that children like sweet tastes more than adults seem to do, and that's in part to get the energy they need for growth. So it's kind of changing our taste preferences in order to meet nutritional demands. And during pregnancy, then I guess you're tasting for two at least, and hence sort of learning to avoid those foods that may be toxic to one's offspring. And at the same time, also, our first taste experiences occur in the womb, so there's a lot of work at the moment about how you can educate the palates of newborns to be more likely to like vegetables by ensuring that the mother consumes vegetable carrot milk, I think the third trimester.
Do we have a question yet at Hamburg? No. Okay, we have one.
Can I just add something? It's also well known that hormones, pregnancy hormones, affect taste perception. So we can't rule out that progesterone plays a role in the gestagens, may play a role in the perception of food as well.
And if you go back to 1965, you'll find a paper by, I think it's Carl Herrick, on a honeymooner's nose, that those who've just got married show a dip in olfactory sensitivity. Hasn't been followed up since.
Just a comment. It seems to be some contradictory things being said here, because you're saying responses are learned, but then Maike told us about the genetic contribution, and I think this taste test you showed just now is a genetic effect.
Barry, you heard that?
I did, yes. Taste is definitely, a lot of it is genetically set, so as we know, and also as Charles pointed out, there's an innate liking for sweetness and aversion for bitterness, but there's also an innate liking for umami, not surprising since 50% of the amino acids in breast milk are glutamate, so they're going to have that umami taste. Smell, however, has to be learned, and there are no universally disliked smells from the get-go. There are, however, preferences which are to do, and that can happen in utero, we know wonderful work by Ben Marshall in Dijon, where one group of pregnant mothers were given fennel smoothies to drink, and the others were told, avoid fennel, avoid aniseed in your diet. And then the neonates were given milk. Both sets of neonates from each group were given milk, one flavored with fennel. And when the children whose mothers were eating the fennel had it, they were happy, whereas the others were spitting it out, blah, 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 finding it disgusting. So yes, there are things that can lead, for sure. But you can acquire tastes, and that's also interesting. So why is it that something, and remember, we're talking about flavors, we're not talking about taste. So of course, if a large part of what flavors are smell and smells, we'll learn preferences, and learn liking, and learn discrimination, because we just discriminate more, that's going to make a difference. Also, should be added that in older age, when your sense of smell declines, most people in their 70s, a quarter of the people in the 70s are functionally nosemic. And so they've got very little sense of smell, which is why you have a lot of older people will say the food doesn't taste as good as it used to, and they often add lots of salt to it, very bad, increase of stroke, coronary heart disease, and that's because the whole flavour profile of something is changing because the sensory apparatus is changing. You can't get at some of the flavours of foods.
Do either of you want to say anything about that? Maike? No. Okay. I'll ask again. Hamburg, nothing? Okay, I hope we haven't lost the connection. Do we have any more questions here? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, following on from the previous comments, two aspects of learning about tastes and their associations that I was wondering about. One is that there is a very strong and obviously evolutionarily useful tendency to avoid tastes that have preceded feeling ill, so that even among animals whom, for the most part, only form negative associations over a relatively short period of time, they tend to become averse to tastes that they experienced an hour or so before feeling ill. And the other is the cultural differences in taste, so that English people who have been brought up only on the English diet may find Chinese or Indian food too spicy, whereas people brought up on Chinese or Indian food may dislike English food. So I was wondering if you could say a little more about both how associations are formed and how cultural differences are formed.
I guess in the specific case of chili liking, it may vary by culture. There's sort of adaptation and loss of the trigeminal cells responding to that chili taste, and hence, if you've been exposed to it early on through your food culture, then you will likely require more chili to get the same taste sensations. It's kind of unlike the other tastes that are just, I guess, replaced as good as new. For chili, it's somewhat different in that regard. And maybe, for me, the more interesting thing is there's been some work on sort of computational gastronomy, analysing recipes from different parts of the world that are all online, and connecting that to chemistry textbooks with all of the flavour molecules you'll find in there, and showing there does seem to be sort of east-west differences in that Western cuisine. I can't get this the right way around. You tend to find ingredients that share compounds overrepresented, whereas in India and China, the recipes seem to be made up of ingredients that do not share anything. So there's a sort of systematic difference that some have claimed, very controversially, but in science, links to whether you're a wheat or a rice-growing culture.
Larry, did you want to say anything to that?
Yes, I just want to, there's a sort of intriguing case we've already brushed on it earlier, and that's when Charles said vanilla smells sweet. So most people in Western diets with the vanilla pods will say it smells sweet. But if you give that to people in Vietnam whose culture, whose cuisine and culture mixes vanilla with salt and with fish, they will say it smells salty. So, you know, that's a brain association that's formed by often combining, in this culture, vanilla with chocolate and ice cream and cake and sweetness. So the brain thinks sweetness and that smell go together, but saltiness and that odor go together in Vietnam. So I kind of think, I have talked to people who've crossed cultures, as it were, and they say they get kind of confusion. They can sort of imagine both of those things, which is a kind of curious experience. But that's both sort of cultural and a matter of mere association.
Okay, I think we do have. Oh, sorry.
Absolutely. Beyond that, also, you might think if they've got Coca-Cola in Vietnam, as they do anywhere else in the world, and that is vanilla and sweetness together. Maybe in Vietnam they have both associations, and they're almost. If you go back to vanilla, seems to be of all smells. It's been claimed that vanilla is the most widely liked across culture. Why should that be, vanilla? And then the suggestion is that you find vanillin, the key compound in vanilla, in breast milk, which again should be another universal, and maybe we're learning those olfactory associations from birth. And so sometimes these flavor compounds appear in strange places, and what we associate them with might depend on our first exposure.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I have a personal striking experience on the same thing, tasting or with different perception of flavor at two different times of the same thing. So originally, when I was much younger, let's say 16, 18, I didn't like wine at all. I only found it sour. My parents liked wine, dry wine. And then sometime 2 years later, I went to a sailing course on the island of Elba, Italy, had a love affair, and was in the evening, the sunset, drinking some white wine, relatively cheap, I have to admit, and it tasted just awesome. Then I thought, this is so nice, let's take 2 bottles home. And then in November, on my own, on a rainy day, I opened one of these bottles, and it really tasted, or the flavor was completely different. I almost spat it out. So is this the power of hedonics, or did it turn bad, or how would you interpret this?
Okay, Barry, I thought you'd want to come in.
Yeah, so Charles knows my view on this. So this is something I call the Provençal rosé paradox, which is, you know, you're sitting there bored and unaware, the sun's beating down, you're with your lovely companion, and they bring the rosé bottle with its sort of condensation out of the ice bucket and pour it. You think, this is the most delicious wine I've ever had. And like you buy bottles, you take it home, you give it to your friends on a wet February evening, and they say, yeah, it's not much this. I think what we're doing is, because the experience of tasting is accompanied by all of those other pleasures and all of those other effects, it's as if the brain binds that together. It's as if you found a very good food source as an animal. You think, this is amazing. And you misattribute to the line all the pleasure that you're having in that situation. And of course, they can't sustain it when you get home. That's what I think is the Provençal rosé paradox. Lovely description of it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is part of what I described in my talk, how the internal state influences how we perceive how much reward we get from a flavor. So the happier you are, the better your emotions. Maybe you also hadn't eaten a lot, so you might have been a bit hungry because you were living off love and air. And so all that, your internal state will have massively influenced your flavor perception.
I think that's absolutely right. We know that when you're hungry, your odor threshold for food smells goes down, so you can detect them more, and when you're sated, it goes up, so that you don't actually detect them as much. But remember, that's determining not flavors, but it's determining what's affecting your flavor perception. And as a professional taster, you want to eliminate things that are going to bias you too much one way or another. So a lot of professional tasters will say if their affect is low, if their affect is flat, they're just not feeling very much, they think their tasting is useless. I'm not getting much out of these wines. So, and that's, I think, because of the physiological connection between primary taste cortex and the amygdala, which runs in both directions, as you know, and that's a center for arousal. So if you're not aroused, I think you're not actually getting as much out of taste perception, flavor perception, particularly the olfactory component, as you might.
Can I throw in a question here? Nobody mentioned the imagination, and I just wondered whether the imagination also can play a role in all this, because if you've got a vivid imagination and you've been told something, or you remember something from childhood or whatever, and then because I had that sensation when you did the jelly bean, I could swear, I'll do it again afterwards, because I've got to see, but I could taste the jelly bean perfectly well with the nose thing, and I wondered whether it was just my imagination. I expected to.
I think you're right that imagination, mental imagery of odours and flavours plays a very important role. One of my students who just had to go out to fencing class, the PhD is going to be exactly on that, kind of food-related mental imagery, and that for me maybe it helps to explain something about the disconnect we see between what wine experts claim to be able to taste in the wine and coming out with 1,000-word descriptions of what's in the wine. And when we test people in the laboratory with food stimuli, the most they can pick apart is 3 notes in the whole experience. So where's the disconnect between 1,000 words and just 3 elements in and I think maybe the wine taster is sort of projecting their imagination, what they think the wine should taste like, what should be in there, and that's combining with some elements from the wine itself, and you get a much richer flavour experience due to imagery there as the wine tasters. But also I think for those elderly people like my father who's 88 who cannot smell anymore, he denies it, and I'm convinced he sees the food, he knows what it should taste like, and he imagines the flavour in a way that he can't sort of pull apart from the actual thing, unless when we give him something that's unfamiliar or where things aren't quite the way they should be, and then he's sort of at a loss because his imagery is telling him one thing and we are tasting things differently.
Thank you, that's exactly what I meant. Did you want to say
So, yeah, oh sorry.
Yeah, you, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, of course, that's right, but of course, not everybody's got olfactory imagery. And in fact, it would be kind of interesting question to ask people in the room how many of them think they can conjure up an odour, say of cut grass or vanilla, as easily as they can run a tune through their head. I mean, people are very different on this. A lot of people, including some professional perfumers, will tell you, I don't have odour imagery, I know something will smell like, but I can't imagine smelling it. Whereas I can vividly imagine the smell of, sawdust or freshly dried paint or cut grass. This is just really powerful. But some people say they don't have that. And I think if you've got that, that's going to, as Charles said, make a difference. The other thing that wine tasters will do is, and I had to cut my slides down for time, but if we believe in predictive coding, and we have to because I'm in London, so very close to Carl Friston in the centre of this, but if you believe in predictive coding, you think that perceiving is not so much taking things in from the senses and figuring out what to think about them, but it's often set by your prior expectations. You're getting signals coming in from the senses and top-down messages, and it's the error signals that are, and the precision weighting of those that is the perception. And I think with professional wine tasters, their priors are very strong, and they often have a first look at a wine and then think they know what it is, and that's determining and dominating. And wine tastings, their first impressions are better, but when they've decided what it is, if they're wrong, they'll down-regulate the incoming signals and stop paying attention to what wine's like. So I do think imagination and prior expectation is huge in flavour perception.
halt there and thank our speakers. Absolutely fantastic. I hope you all can go home and think about the fantastic things you've learned tonight and think some more.
Anyone who wants to come up? What's this green plant doing here? I brought all the way from Somerville from our head gardener. And this is another taste. We haven't even started to talk about, maybe it is electric. It's an electric daisy or paracress that will amazingly, these leaves make you salivate and give you a tingling electric sensation that raises some other questions.